A very good morning to you, and thank you very much for joining this morning's webinar, which is a floating wind webinar featuring Celtic Sea Cluster. Now, my name's Jeya Calder from Highlands and Islands Enterprise, and I would just like to go over a couple of things if this is the first time that you've joined GoToWebinar. We're recording today's session. If you come in as an attendee, you're automatically put on mute, but don't worry, there's a couple of ways that we would love to get you involved in this morning's session. You'll see a question box, so please use that question box for questions or observations throughout the whole of the session. And you'll also see an icon, and it looks a little bit like a raised hand icon. And when we come to a Q&A towards the end of our webinar, if you click on that, that will give me the ability to take you off mute and speak directly to our speakers. But first of all, I would like to pass over to Paul O'Brien from Highlands and Islands Enterprise to start our webinar. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeya. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the first of our Floating Wind subgroup webinars. We've just really launched the Floating Wind subgroup, and this is one of the first activities that we're undertaking as part of the new subgroup. Just like to thank both Steve and Matt from the Celtic Sea Cluster for agreeing to come along and tell us about what's happening in floating wind in their area, because we really have, at the minute, the two areas in the UK and Scotland and down in the southwest and South Wales area is where we're looking at floating wind. Now, the launch of the floating offshore wind cluster in DeepWind, so far we have attracted about 60 odd of our members to join the subgroup, and we're of course looking for more to join. And with a bit of luck, we have two co-chairs from EDPR Renewables, Andronicus, and also Julia from Fugro, who should be in the audience. And with a bit of luck, if we've got the capability, we can let Julia say a few words of welcome. Julia.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Delighted to be joining you all today, and very happy to be able to pick up the role of supply chain co-chair for the Floating Offshore Wind subgroup. For anyone that doesn't know me, my name is Julia Roop, and I'm Fugro's Global Business Development Manager for Offshore Wind.
Great. Okay, thank you, Julia, for that. I thought it would be worthwhile just making an intro to one of the co-chairs. Right, so without further ado, we will get straight on to the main event, and it's a presentation from both Steve and Matt. So over to you. I think it's Steve that's beginning.
Hi, Paul. Yeah, that's fine. It's a presentation from me, and then, as we've discussed, we thought we would go out to question and answer for the webinar session. So if that's okay with you, Paul, we will get on, and I'll introduce myself and the session. My name's Steve Jermy. I work in Cornwall, down in an organisation called Wave Hub, wholly owned by Cornwall Council, and currently the owner of a offshore site. It's a test site for wave energy, but actually being converted to floating offshore wind. I also sit on our local enterprise partnership as a non-executive director, where I've got responsibility for marine and energy matters. The local enterprise partnership is a bit like Highlands and Islands Enterprises, as far as I can see, in terms of organisation. What I'm going to do in about the next 20 or so minutes is just to talk you through what we've got to in floating offshore wind in the southwest. So although we're based in Cornwall, we're representing essentially Cornwall, South Wales. We've got a very close relationship with the Welsh Government, and last but not least, the Great Southwest out as far as Bristol. Here then is the structure of the presentation. I'm going to start initially and talk a little bit about the geopolitical and the policy context for what we've been doing. I'll say a little bit about floating offshore wind and indeed the offshore wind story so far, and then I'll talk about what we've been doing in the county. And I hope that will give a reasonable structure for questions and answers. It's an exciting time for us, very exciting to be in this industry. I've been working it for the last 10 or so years for a company called Mojo Maritime, became James Fisher's, and I think on the basis of what I'm seeing, this is the most exciting development in the industry for that decade. So there's the structure, and we'll start initially. I think we all know about the climate emergency declaration. Great advantage of that is it's really focused people's attention on what we're doing. We've had a climate emergency declaration from Cornwall Council and one from the Local Enterprise Partnership, and green energy is therefore top dead centre. We also draw people's attention to the overall energy security situation, and here on this chart, which I routinely use, you can see the areas in orange and red and amber, and those are pretty much the areas where we source our current energy from, and you can see those aren't always the most stable places in the world. The biggest of those sources, interestingly, is the Gulf, of course, but also Russia. We've talked a little bit about what's going down here in Cornwall. The Cornwall Council has announced climate emergency with an adaptation and a mitigation part of their strategy, and we in the Local Enterprise Partnership have also announced one. Meanwhile, we're also trying to draw together a local industrial strategy to feed into BEIS's industrial strategy and secure a strategy, if you like, to actually help grow out a number of sectors. One of the top 3 sectors in this is offshore renewables, particularly offshore wind. Let's move then to the story so far. The way that I've presented this for some time, and if you look at the left diagram, it is where the current Crown Estate portfolio of projects are in the offshore wind sector. You'll see essentially that with 1 or 2 exceptions, it's largely speaking a North Sea portfolio with something in the Irish Sea and off Scotland as well, now just starting to develop. On the right hand side, you'll see plans. These are slightly out of date, but again, it gives you a sense of where the intentions for the Crown Estate were to develop further. It's worth thinking though about floating offshore wind. Of course, what floating offshore wind allows us to do is to go deeper. And when you look at the cut-offs for floating offshore wind, it becomes pretty clear pretty quickly that there are only 2 regions where floating wind will be built out at scale. They're in the southwest approaches to the west of Cornwall and in Scotland, and the Scottish waters, the most attractive of which I think in long term is west of the Shetlands, but also the most challenging, but with other very attractive areas in other Scottish waters. So that's the story of offshore wind so far, if you like. I often describe this as a strategic success for Britain, in as much as we've got more offshore wind in total than the rest of the world put together. Or nearly the rest of the world put together. Sometimes, though, it's perhaps a lost opportunity as well. Here's the firms that we routinely deal with, or some of the firms that we routinely with, and as you'll see, Orsted, Vattenfall, Siemens, Vestas, I could go on and on. There aren't that many British companies in this, and certainly none on this list. And that, I think, is a shortfall, and it's something where I think we can do better. Furthermore, we will need to do better because we've got from BEIS a requirement within the offshore wind sector deal, or a target for us to get 60% content in our own farms and to increase our export levels by 5. Looking more locally, this is what we've been doing in Cornwall, which is to try to draw together our overall climate emergency declaration from the council and our local enterprise declaration from the Local Enterprise Partnership into an overall strategy entitled Zero Carbon Cornwall. What was interesting as we started to work this up was this, which is in red. You see what we require down here in terms of transport, heat and power, and in green for a county which is, I would say, one of the leading counties in England in terms of renewables. You can see what we're supplying. So here on this diagram, it's quite obvious that there is a big ask. And that ask in rough terms is about 1 gigawatt's worth of power, perhaps a little bit more of that with capacity factors, but it's a big ask in a relatively short space of time if we're to hit that target by 2030. The reason I say that is I think one of the only technologies that is going to unlock this ask is offshore wind, but in particular floating offshore wind. So turning to floating offshore, and why are we excited about it? I'm excited about it as a guy who's been working in this sector. I'm a master mariner by background, but very interested in all the other engineering aspects. Firstly, we can mass produce floating offshore wind platforms. Secondly, we can construct them in shelter waters as opposed to employing expensive DP vessels and jack-up barges at high day rates and subject to high weather factors. Third, we can take the biggest turbines. 10 megawatts is out there now, and 15 megawatts on the horizon. I think 12.5, or I think 12 is about the biggest we're seeing at the moment with GE. But we know that 15 megawatts is in the target area. We can access the best wind resources, and in broad terms, I would say that the best wind resources in the country are in Scotland, and then followed by the southwest approaches off Cornwall. And those best wind resources are only accessible if you can deploy into deeper waters. And last but not least, we can scale rapidly. This, I think, is a technology which is much more open to mass production in a way that fixed offshore wind isn't, not least because the foundations can be mass produced, which isn't the case in fixed offshore wind. The technology's potential, what I put down there are the high wind capacity factors, which is a 58% capacity factor, which for those of you who understand the industry, it's a really impressive figure. And they're figures which I've looked at from Equinor's data, and it is actually 58%, and so that's very exciting in terms of what it can do in terms of yield. And Equinor are predicting, on the basis of the high wind project and other bits of their analysis, a levelized cost of energy of between 40 and 50 euros a megawatt hour, which is an extraordinary figure in terms of getting there. What's going on down in our neck of the woods? We've been doing a number of pieces of work, but perhaps the most interesting for techie people like me is this one, which was done for us by the Offshore Renewable Energy Catapult, who've got an office down here in Cornwall and an office in Wales. And you can see in this picture the zones that we're starting to look at for floating offshore wind. I won't go into too much detail other than to say that we're looking at a constraint of about 100 meters, although we know that we can go shallower to 250 meters. That's based on carbon trust work, and being within around about 360 to 300 miles of the local ports. But what is interesting is if you look at this area and look at the overall potential for installed capacity in these 5 zones, it's somewhere north of 150 gigawatts against an overall UK requirement at a maximum power requirement of 43 gigawatts. So these are levels of power which are over and above Britain's needs and therefore exportable. I would imagine that they will be even higher in Scottish waters. There is also, of course, an export market. I often show this slide. It's from the BP Outlook analysis. BP do an energy outlook analysis every year. And I think that headline figure is important to give you a sense of where we're going. So in other words, renewables, they believe, will scale more quickly than any fuel in history. I would guess, on the basis of what I know about the sector, that offshore renewables will scale at the quickest, offshore wind. And last but not least, I think within the offshore wind, floating offshore will be the very quickest. So this is a fantastic opportunity in what is already a fantastic industry. It's not just UK. Where you look at blue dots on this diagram, those are actual projects that are running. And so we can see there already is a market in the UK of extant projects. And it's not just in the UK, but also abroad. There are blue projects running already in the Far East. And last but not least, there's a lot of people looking at America as well, where there is a developing floating offshore wind market. Let's say a little bit now about what we're doing in the county. We've been working for the best part of 2 years now with BEIS to see if we can secure the sector for the southwest. That started with a discussion with the Energy Minister, a face-to-face discussion in July of 2018, followed by this ministerial submission, which you're seeing in front of you now. I won't bore you with the details on that, but really set out the opportunity for floating offshore wind. We then had subsequent meetings with the Energy Minister. There has been a political agreement to form something called the Celtic Sea Alliance between the Cornish, the Welsh and the Irish Southern Ireland. and at a lower level, at an industry level, the Celtic Sea Cluster, which is a cluster alliance, equivalent, if you like, to the DeepWind Celtic Sea Cluster, which is the Cornish, the Welsh, and the Great Southwest. We've had meetings with Treasury officials, fed into number 10 on issues on floating offshore wind, and have just completed providing our inputs into the Bay's contracts for different consultation, which was fascinating because there were 4 pages in there dedicated to floating offshore wind. We know that there is a manifesto commitment to floating offshore wind in the Conservative manifesto, and as far as we can see, Bays are now putting that into practice through the consultations for difference, and I expect floating offshore wind to be funded at some sort of level in the CFD in the auction rounds ahead. There has been other work going on. The catapult have been, sorry about that. The catapult have been doing work for us in the broad macroeconomic benefits of floating offshore wind, and the catapult are also doing other work, which is, or completed other work, which is purely for Wales and the Southwest, which again is on the benefits for floating offshore wind, but very much in terms of the economic benefits that we're likely to see in this county. And last but not least, we've been looking at in this area about where we might deploy this technology. So, which was where you saw that map. What does the pipeline look like? The pipeline's developing. We're not as far ahead as Scotland. We don't have the High Wind project, of course, nor Kincardine, which are terrific opportunities. But we have what will probably be the 3rd floating offshore wind array project, which in the country, which is the Wave Hub project. That's the project that I'm leading on at the moment, 30 megawatts, and converting the offshore wind site, which was a wave energy site at Hale, down here in Cornwall, to floating offshore wind. We're doing well with that. Gone to the open market just recently to actually sell that site to a project developer, and we've got interest in the site from across the world. A company called Simply Blue, with whom we've worked closely, have just teamed up with Total, who are now driving forward on the Erebus site. This is around about this area. That's around about 96 megawatts and will be targeted for AR5. In parallel, Pembrokeshire Demonstration Zone, which is this site here, may also meet for AR5, but probably more likely AR6. Matt Hodson, who is on this call, is leading on that site for us. It's a Welsh site, but being the project developer is being run by us down here on Wave Hub. And last but by no means least, we have in mind 2 further sites, 2 at 500 megawatts, and an overall vision of something in the order of 2.5 gigawatts in the Celtic Sea by 2030. That's not a sanctioned vision by any means, but it's the thing that we want to be able to deliver, and we do believe is possible. We also think that the same thing should be possible in Scotland, and we'd like to think that between the 2 regions we can meet half of the new increase of 10 gigawatts to British floating offshore wind resources by 2030. Here's what the Wave Hub site looks like. I won't say too much about it. Happy to take questions on it. We've got the space for 3 or 4 turbines, depending on the size of the turbines, in a relatively limited area. It's not a perfect site, but the point is that it's consented, which is, or near to be consented, which means that it's available quickly. Here's the sorts of opportunity on the site to give you some sense of what capex will be involved. It's probably a site in the order of, it will be a project in the order of 150 million. It's those sorts of figures. And within that, the opportunity, supply chain opportunities are probably in the order of about sort of 30 or 40, or probably not quite as much as 50% of that spend, but as a fair whack of it. I think it's a challenge to actually get high figures because, of course, we don't have British turbine manufacturers. So for that reason, we've got to look to clean up elsewhere. This is a slide which is produced by the Offshore Renewable Energy Catapult and gives you a sense of what will be required to deliver a 1 gigawatt floating offshore wind site. It's illustrative only, but it nevertheless gives you a sense of the industrial opportunity involved and the supply chain opportunities involved. Again, that's illustrative figures from the Catapult's work, but nevertheless extremely interesting if you're a supply chain company thinking about coming into the floating offshore wind sector or bidding into the floating offshore wind sector. So rather than talk more, let me just draw this all to a close and give you a sense of why we're really, really excited by this opportunity. Unlike wave and tidal, which Matt and I have both been involved for the last 10 years, floating offshore wind is investable, and it can also scale quickly. I'm passionate about wave energy, and I'm passionate about tidal energy, but in the Hywind project in Scotland, more capacity was installed than in the whole of the wave and the tidal sector in the whole of its life. The technology meets our net zero contributions and the targets there. It's the only technology I think that we could deliver a net zero contribution in Cornwall by 2030. It meets our local industrial strategy aspirations. I would also say that it meets a COVID-19 re-energization strategy. It has the potential to export, and there are no world leaders in this at the moment. I think Britain has a perfect chance to be part of that. The work that's been done to unlock the market is going well. So the contracts for difference consultation looks good to us. It looks like it's there and designed to help us unlock the sector. We have projects in the pipeline which will allow us so to do. And I think the last thing to say is that we're now starting to work on the industrialization and what that really means, and making sure that the key parts of the supply chain and the infrastructure are there, so that as we start to build out, we can fit the whole thing together. Two key parts, I would say, are grid and ports, but again, we're starting work on those now to make sure that we are in place to deliver those, or make sure that those are there to deliver the Celtic Sea. So if I was going to summarize, I think it would just be to remake this one point, which is that this, to me, is one of the best, if not the best, renewable energy, offshore renewable energy that I've ever seen in my experience. I think that this country and that these two regions, Scotland and the Southwest, are very well placed to actually get a world leadership part of it, and I think that should be our focus. If we can do that, this is the place that I would certainly want to industrialize this capability. But if we can do that and industrialize this capability, then I think we have the chance to do something which we've failed to do in conventional offshore, which is to take a really significant export market. Paul, I think that's probably enough for me rabbiting on. Shall I hand back to you now and take it from there?
Okay, right. Thanks, Steve, for that. You might want to switch your cameras on then if we're going to move into the Q&A session. So I'll just remind everyone, if you've got any questions to ask, please use the chat feature to just type in the question, and we'll get to as many of them as we can in the time. So let me just turn on my own camera, actually. Yep, that's us. Good-o. Now, we'll kick off with, just before we start that, the one thing I was going to sort of, just when you were going through that, Steve, so it's good to hear what's happening down the southwest. We already have some links between DeepWind and yourselves. We have shared membership. So both the developers you mentioned, Total and Simply Blue Energy, are also members of DeepWind. So we have direct contact between the membership. Okay, right, let's have a look at some of the questions, and I'll put them to you, and you can decide whether it's Steve or Matt's going to do the answering of these questions. The first one, first off the top, is a question about actual manufacture of the substructures. How do you see the current supply chain in the UK for mass production of floating platforms? And I suppose that, although it says UK, I suppose it really we're talking southwest. Who wants to take that?
I'd love to take it, but I think it's much better that Matt does, because I've been banging on for too long. So Matt, you go and take that one first.
Thanks, Steve. Well, but introduce myself first. I'm sort of conscious that my name's been sort of bandied around, but good afternoon. Is it afternoon? Just about. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for having me. Matt Hodson. I'm Cornwall Development Company's Marine Operations Director. Cornwall Development Company is the council's economic development agency. I'm working with Steve at Wave Hub as the PZ program director, and also working on some of the Celtic Sea Cluster development. I've also got another hat on which looks at marine tech, RD&I in the county as well. So a number of different hats, with a background in the merchant navy, ports, harbours and renewables. That's enough about me. So in terms of supply chain capability to mass produce floaters, I think it would be fair to say that if we were going to do this today, it's not ready. I think that would be a fair thing to say about the Southwest. But in terms of opportunity and capability, I think there's very much the time is right to start looking at that strategically. I tell you what has been fascinating, and I don't know if any of the guys from Blue Gem are in the room, but certainly since that's been announced, we have had different dialogue with some of the larger engineering companies in the region, and it gives me confidence that there's an appetite to sort of look at whether primary steel and whether assembly is something that can be tackled both in the Southwest and in the UK in general. I think there is it's definitely a conversation worth having, but you know, in terms of the added benefit to the UK PLC, there is also the sort of, if we have a low carbon economy, do we really want to be sort of chasing steel or halfway around the world for a project here, or when we have the capability to do it in this country? I won't mention names because that would be inappropriate at this stage, but there is sort of large steel producers in the region, and as I say, that there is a different tone coming from those larger companies, and I think that helps, you know, in terms of the pipeline we're starting to see come in front of us.
Okay.
Steve?
All right, thanks for that. One of the other questions was actually about whether the presentation would be made available. So Steve, if you can let us have that, yeah, we can put it up on the website and put it out to everyone so that they can download it. We're also recording this. Jeya, are we safe to say the recording will be available, or is that going to take a bit longer?
It always takes a bit longer, but as soon as we can, you'll get your presentation and any other sort of answers to questions that we don't have time to cover today, and your recording will follow. Thanks.
Great. Okay. Sticking with the supply chain questions then, there was a question from Kevin here. It says, I'm assuming that I'm getting this right. Is there an overarching supply chain for all of these initiatives?
I'll start that with Matt, but I think it's a sort of chicken and egg question, really. The answer is the supply chain is what it is. Is there an aspiration to have a supply chain which can deliver as much as possible? Yeah, of course is. I think that's essential, and the reason is that we've been given this target by government of a 60% content, and to deliver that, actually, you pretty much need to have an overarching supply chain. Let me give you an example. At the moment, I think that British content in the conventional offshore wind sector is around 42%. So if we're going to get 60%, there's a way to go. But the difference is that this is a new sector in many ways, and therefore we've got the opportunity to actually make sure that all the work we do, regional investments as such, I'm sure it'll be the same with Scottish Enterprise, you'll be thinking in the same way as the local enterprise down here, is to make sure we do those investments in ports, in grid, and other parts of the supply chain, so that we can actually have a, largely speaking, homegrown supply chain able to deliver as much content as possible. Matt, though, you're a better supply chain expert than me.
I think supply chain expert is a stretch, but I'll take that, Steve. Yeah, I agree. It's something I feel really strongly about. There is no lack of capability, ambition, skill, ability, innovation in the UK to capture 60% UK content. That there really isn't. I mean, we're talking virtually in a country here today that built out the North Sea. it's well within our grasp and capability to do it, but we have to be realistic about what it's going to take to get there. I think the chicken and egg analogy is a good one. If we sit back and wait for the chicken to lay that egg, we will lose the opportunity. So I think there's a very real need for us all to come together and start asking ourselves, what do we need to look like in 2030? And then when we know what we need to look like in 2030, then there's some interesting challenges to overcome, but at least we know what we're facing.
Okay, thanks, guys. Next one is in relation to the discussion earlier about the activity that you're having in the Celtic Sea and a great deal of engagement with your catapult in the region. And the question is, have you also engaged with the Floating Offshore Wind Centre of Excellence, which was really recently set up by the ORE catapult?
Yeah. Do you want me to take that one, Steve? So yeah, absolutely. So the team who are in Cornwall, and in fact the team based in Pembroke as well, are form part of that Centre of Excellence. The Floating Offshore Wind Centre of Excellence is almost, it's like has a hub and spoke type model. So the team that we're involved with are a direct link back into that. So yeah, absolutely. I will say the catapult have been, very, very supportive and very helpful in supporting what we're looking to do as a region and as a country, actually.
Okay, cheers, Matt. Now we've got a question. I'll actually reverse these two because there's two that's sort of connected, I think. You might think differently, but I'll do the second one first. Do you see advantage in concrete versus steel regarding the availability of manufacturing facilities in the UK?
I think we both want to answer that.
Steve, you go first then.
I'll start, but I think both will have their strengths and weaknesses. The advantage of concrete, of course, is that it opens the regional construction opportunities much more. We've got a number of concrete companies down here, and what we like to call green concrete, which is basically uses mining extracts to actually make the concrete. So I think there's an open question there. I think though that this is just one of these things where we're not going to know really which is likely to lead. I mean, Ideol, who are one of the leading floater developers, have got both concrete and steel solutions. But my sense is we're probably not going to know the answers until we've started to really build out at scale, and we've got a couple of gigawatts underneath our belt to see which, if any, of those two technologies predominate. I don't think that we should be frightened of thinking about steel construction in this country, because I think over time what will happen is that as people become more and more carbon aware, the idea of, for example, constructing a floating platform in, say, China and then shipping it around the world at very high carbon costs won't make quite so much sense. And the idea of doing things locally will make a lot more sense. And I think that carbon differentiator will point us towards much more local fabrication. Matt, do you want to add?
Yeah, no, I think you've covered it off. I think it's that the advantage of concrete is it has to be a local solution. But so I would agree with you, Steve, that the drive to sort of low carbon footprint operations should force us to open our minds to any solutions.
I'm going to really sort of push the boat out here and test the technology to the limit. We've got two folk that, talking of testing the technology to the limit, I thought we were going to lose Matt there. We have a couple of hands up, which means that we've got a couple of folk that would like to ask their question. So if we can go to Kevin Black.
Kevin has dropped off, but we have covered his question. But we can go to Ignacio, and I'll take Ignacio off mute. Good afternoon, Ignacio. That's you off mute now. Thank you.
Oh, good afternoon. So, What is the question exactly? Sorry, what do you request from me?
You've
sorry,
submitted
you put your hand.
questions. Yeah, Ignacio,
Oh,
you've
sorry,
submitted some questions that we have.
Yes. I submitted the question about the steel versus concrete and the supply chain in UK. Well, I am responsible for the floating offshore wind of Iberdrola Scottish Power, and we are being very active in pursuing several opportunities. And of course, we are doing our analysis of the supply chain in UK, mainly focusing at ScotWind, where the floating areas are considered. We are having exactly the same dilemma, whether go with concrete or steel. I think the steel technologies are now more mature. They have already put in the water several of those technologies. Concrete are a little bit behind, and I think that concrete will be a major player for the reduction of the cost as a competitor or concurrence with steel. But in countries like UK or in the north of Europe, where the conditions for concrete are relatively demanding, it is completely different to do an infrastructure work like a dam or a road, where you can control the planning of the project. If we compare that with a mass production of concrete units that we have to deliver one unit every a few weeks in order to make a floating offshore project feasible, we have a lot to discuss here, not only with the technology developer for the floater foundation, for the floating platform, but especially with the concrete supplier and manufacturers. They will have to change a lot deeply their way of working for this kind of projects. We are involved in a project in concrete. One of our targets that we want to check with our demonstrator project is precisely that, is how to adapt the mass production and the industrialization of a concrete solution to a project. So we are not doing a demonstrator for the sake of testing the platform in concrete. We are doing it more for checking how to change and adapt the manufacturing process. Because you are expert in the supply chain and you know UK better than me. That's the reason because I raise this question.
Thank you so much.
Okay,
it was great to hear from you. Thank you. Go
Very
back
welcome.
to you.
That's really interesting. Thanks for sharing. Yeah.
Now, I realise that we're a bit short in time, so I'm going to try and run through as many of the outstanding questions as possible. There was one asking if you had considered any other industrial hubs in Europe. I suspect that what that's asking there is for manufacture.
That's a question for the project developers. So you know, we're not neither Matarine nor our project developers, and that really I think is a question for the project developers.
Okay.
But there's probably a supply chain. I think there's a supply chain question as well, which Matt has just fed back in our contracts for difference. So you know, we aren't actively looking at other sectors, but I would other industrial regions, but I would expect project developers so to do to actually as part of their overall competitive process.
Okay. There was also a question about WaveHub planning to test hybrid wind wave technologies as part of AR4 2021. If yes, in which extent, or to which extent?
We are in terms of at the moment I'm in the process of divesting the WaveHub project, and when we do that, we're essentially technology agnostic. So if the purchaser wants to install floating offshore wind turbines, that's fine. If the purchaser wants to install hybrid platforms, that's fine too. What we're really interested in, I suspect it will be floating, because I don't think that the hybrids are as advanced as the floating platforms. So I suspect that's what the project developer will go for. But ultimately, this will be a choice for the project developer who actually purchases the site.
Okay. One that sounds as if it might, the questions, I'll just read out the question, in fact, and you can make up your own mind what it's asking. With a local demand of approximately 1.2 gigawatts, what needs to be done to capitalise on this huge potential resource, i.e. ensuring a suitable pathway to the larger demand centres up country? So I'm assuming this is referring to grid.
Do you want to take that, Matt?
Yeah, I can take that. So we're actually in the process of doing a study at the moment which addresses that. I think for a lot of people, unless you're involved in the national grid, it's all a bit of sort of magic, isn't it, really? And we sort of go round and round the circles going, well, are we constrained? Are we not constrained? Who's really sure? So we are trying to answer that question. So I don't want to sort of jump ahead of what it might be, other than to say that for the region, we are, you know, fairly comfortable that the first gigawatt potentially come ashore in Pembroke. There's headroom there. The national grid terminates at Pembroke Dock, which is handy. So there's a useful grid connection there. In the southwest and coming out of Cornwall, it might not be as problematic as was initially first thought. So the demand centres beyond the southwest for us will be the Midlands, and yeah, that's something we're looking at now as, you know, what is the solution, and you know, what would be the sort of potential cost. You know, it's an interesting one, grid, isn't it? It's back to that chicken and egg. You know, when you look at sort of some of the grid reinforcement costs, they look a bit eye-watering, and then you consider it within the context of the generating costs, the capex, and the potential wins that you will get holistically, and all of a sudden it doesn't seem so eye-watering. So yeah, I think there's a real need for us to look at these things in the round together. It's that chicken and egg. We need to kind of I don't know, we need to get a chicken who doesn't need to lay eggs, an artificially inseminated egg. That's what we need.
I think
Right,
if I could just add to all, I think it's important to recognise that this floating offshore wind and the resources out there are of national significance. So it's not just a question, I think, of us. Of course, we want to reinforce the grid and get the sector down here. But when you look at it in the overall energy mix, this is a technology which is of national significance, will allow us to balance the offshore wind portfolio across 3 different distinctive regions. So I would expect to get government support in this, because it's in government's interest for us to get this right.
Okay, right, we'll move on to, we're running out of time, so we'll make this one the last question. And you're talking about government support there. Well, this refers to that. Do you think that the manufacturer and overall EPC Tier 1 contracts could be won by UK companies in this sector? And is there the possibility of UK government making local UK supply chain content mandatory?
I know Matt will want to answer this one.
So yes. I feel passionately that we should be really being ambitious, and that we should be looking at the EPC Tier 1 contractors being UK companies. That is a personal view, but I think what's the simplest way to get 60% UK content? Get a turnkey package for the whole 60%, and then work out how you're going to deliver it thereafter. It's a very simple view of life, but to be blunt, I'm a very simple sailor. But yeah, so I do believe that that's something that should be our ambition. We've got to get ourselves there and work out how we're going to do it. In terms of making it mandatory, mandatory, I think that's probably tricky. But we can certainly, and certainly the recent CFD consultation had a fairly sort of firm push towards strengthening the need for supply chain plans. And I think that's the important thing, is making sure that we are properly understanding how government subsidy at one end is, I've got a slow webcam here, sorry. Sorry about that, everyone. But yeah, making sure that our revenue subsidies generally do drive our low carbon supply chain. I think that's really, really important. I'd probably stop short of saying making it mandatory, because I suspect that breaches all sorts of international law. But the principle is probably sound.
Well, okay, on that important note, we'll draw that to a close now. We're out of time.
Hi, can you hear me?
If there's anyone that's asked questions, we will get back to you and get the answers for you. So just like to thank Steve and Matt and Jeya for hosting this event for us, and hope to hear from you very soon about the projects. Floating wind, they can't be that far off. You're possibly going to get to them before we get to some of the ScotWind ones, so that's good. Okay, Jeya, anything else to just finish off?
No, just a big thank you to our speakers and to our audience. There's never enough time for these webinars. We just love your interaction and appreciate it. And recording the presentation and answers to some of the questions that we didn't cover will follow. So thank you to everyone, and that concludes our webinar. Have a good day, everyone. Bye-bye now.
Thanks now.